Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that today we're meeting on the lands of my ancestors, the Wurundjeri people. And I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to my elders, both past and present. Wominjeka welcome. Wurundjeri Ball, Yemen Kondi Bik. The Wurundjeri people welcome everyone to the land today. Wurundjeri no Budambal War, Kondi Nangnak, Dubadan Bik Bulik Bor, Tilikan. The Wurundjeri people want you to look after and protect the land as they did long before. Wurundjeri country extends from the inner city of Melbourne. It goes across the mountains of the Great Dividing Range, west to the Werribee River, south to the Mordialloc Creek and east to Mount Baw Baw. And the Wurundjeri people are part of the Kulin Nations and of the Warong language group. Hello, my name is Colin Hunter Jr. or Woolert, meaning possum, a name given to me by my grandmother as a young boy. I'm a proud and passionate 7th-generation Wurundjeri man and a direct descendant of Bibijan, who was Nullingeta, or head of the tribe at time at first settlement. It's through my grandmother, Gumbriar, meaning white dove, or Rani Tiny or Nanish, who is known to us mob, that I have Aboriginal culture and heritage in my life today, so for that I say thanks, Nan. My grandmother was one of the last Aboriginal people born in the early 1920s up at Coranderrick Mission in Hillsville before she got moved up to Barham on the Murray River, New South Wales. In Aboriginal culture, a great deal of respect is given to the land, the plants and the animals alike. And these gum leaves I've got in my hand here, they're a gift from the Wurundjeri people to you. And the significance of them is they'll keep you safe while on country and give you the accesses to the resources while you're on country. While you're on Wurundjeri country, you're welcome to everything from the tops of the trees to the roots of the earth. So Wominjeka, welcome. Thank you.
This conversation is about lessons that we've learned or perhaps haven't learned from moderating Australia's recent Indigenous voice referendum. Now, before we get into everything, I just want to give you a little tiny bit of context about what that is or was if you're not from Australia or you're unsure. So last year, at the end of last year, Australia held a national referendum. It's a process by which we make constitutional changes. We don't have them very often, but we do have them and they're put to a national vote. And this was regarding enshrining an Indigenous voice to Parliament into our constitution that would allow representatives from First Nations communities around the country, many different First Nations communities, to have a specific contextual localized say on policies and legislative mechanisms that directly affect them and their communities. That was put to a vote nationally, and as a part of that process there were campaigns on the yes side, yes we think this is a good idea, and no we don't think this is a good idea. They were nationally executed and played out across social media in formal and informal ways, and as you can probably imagine, that lifted the lid on a lot of really problematic stuff. So we did, although a lot of people were conducting a very civil discourse around that, it unfortunately did also open the doors for a rise in racism, a rise in hate speech, a rise in other online harms directed at members of First Nations communities or those who were allied to them. And those moderating our digital frontline spaces on social media had to deal with that. They had to face that. And some of those folk holding court and moderating those conversations were First Nations peoples themselves, compounding that trauma. I want to call out the fact that we don't have any First Nations people on this panel. There's a reason for that. So in preparing this conversation, in consulting and considering what we wanted to address and how we endeavoured to do so mindfully and respectfully, we talked with a number of First Nations moderators and community managers around Australia. Every single one of them said that they would rather not participate in this conversation directly due to the risks of compounding trauma, which we completely and utterly respect. However, they all did say that they endorse the fact that we're going to have the conversation, and they thought it was important that we try to do this. So a number of our panelists have talked with their First Nations peers or folks that they work with or for, also in preparation for this conversation, so that has occurred, never as deeply as we probably like, but it has occurred, and there's a really important reason that they're not sitting here today with us. So let me just introduce everybody. We have Dave Early, the wonderful Dave. Now, Dave is audience editor at The Guardian, Australia. He's had decades worth of experience in managing and moderating all sorts of online communities in the media space, and he does some fantastic work at The Guardian. And so he's going to speak to the perspective of his experience moderating The Voice from The Guardian. We have Catherine Perrott, and she is representing the ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, our national broadcaster, who maintain countless online social media communities across many different brands, including national and Indigenous specific conversations. And last but not least, we have Dan Sousa, who works with Quiip. He's a senior community manager with Quiip, a social media agency, who moderates for a number of media organisations, including Special Broadcasting Service, and he also was on the front lines throughout this process for those organisations. Dr. Jennifer Beckett was once a community manager for the ABC, which is amazing, and has worked with a lot of different orgs. But more recently, she is forged an amazing career as a communities academic, specialising in areas around moderation, governance, moderator wellbeing, and things like that. So she's going to be our host. I'm now going to disappear and tip my hat and do a Homer Simpson into the hedge. It's going to be a really important conversation. I'll note, as I know you will as well, Jen, that this conversation may well raise some issues that will be sensitive, particularly for any First Nations viewers or listeners that we have either live or asynchronously. So please do take note of that. There will be some discussion around online hate, and we will touch on some traumatic concepts. But I'll leave that in your capable hands, Jen.
So hello from the University of Melbourne, which sits on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also to extend that respect to any First Nations people who are with us today or who may be watching this asynchronously later. So the Voice referendum asked Australians a very simple question. Should Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have a say over the legislation that governs them, a voice to our parliament? The debate over this was contentious, vitriolic, and came with an avalanche of racism, mis and disinformation. Sadly, the country voted no, and the fallout continues to affect conversations around Indigenous affairs today. And this is particularly noteworthy as we are coming into Reconciliation Week in Australia. So during that time, our news organisations were responsible for moderating enormous amounts of often difficult and problematic content. And as we head into election season in the US and with all of, well, I'm at the University of Melbourne, so everything that's happening globally, what can we learn from this time? And that's what we are looking at. So Vanessa has happily, and thank you very much for stepping in, Vanessa, introduced our wonderful panelists. What was the overall approach to moderation for the Voice referendum at your various organisations?
Yeah, so the approach was fairly structured because we at The Guardian have had on-site Guardian comments on news stories for 15 years or more, with Guardian employed moderation team and community management team. And so there's a lot of background there in terms of experience with moderation. And they've also, our local moderators in Australia have developed a Indigenous mod guidance notes for the international moderation team. And so that's been something that has been a work in progress over the years and has had, as needed, more things added to it as it comes up recently. But having been having published a lot on Indigenous affairs for a long time, the Guardian moderators have already been prepared, very well prepared for that. And so while it was a ramping up of comments and work to be done in moderation of comments, the preparation was, the groundwork was laid a long time in advance, I think.
Okay, thanks. Catherine, the ABC has some interesting approaches to moderation, which are in a positive sense, interesting, including a First Nations-led approach to moderation in general. How did you approach The Voice as an organisation?
Yeah, so I mean, just a lot of planning around all aspects of the whole thing, staffing, wellbeing considerations, workflows in general, just including like prepared responses to questions, upward referral plans, how we were filtering our moderation cues as well was a big focus. Yeah, and importantly, we consulted on our approach with the ABC Indigenous team. Staff were also invited to sessions before the referendum with the staff leading the referendum coverage so they could ask them any questions they had ahead of time. And just consideration of staff members' lived experiences as well was really key. So, for example, we spoke to staff members who are Indigenous about whether they were comfortable even working that weekend and then rostered accordingly. Yeah, and like was mentioned actually in a session earlier today about being the audience's voice within the organisation, that was a really big thing for us too with moderation, that we were feeding back any audience questions or topics of interest to like editorially that could inform our coverage too.
Fantastic. Dan, you were taking care of 3 separate organisations during this time. NTIV, which is the Indigenous.
Yeah, NITV.
NITV, which is this part of my brain just goes to the UK, which is terrible in this situation. NITV, which is the Indigenous media channel in Australia, SBS, and also the Australian Democracy Museum. What was the approaches at those different organisations in the lead up?
Yeah, well, as Dave said, it was very structured. So there was a lot of groundwork, probably for the good 6 weeks leading up to it, led to the actual weekend of the referendum. There's a lot of consultation with NITV and SBS themselves, obviously being a First Nations-led team within the NITV team. They made the decision that the NITV team would not be moderating for the week leading up or the week following, because there was, as mentioned, a lot of negative engagement. But yeah, it was very much a structured approach focused on knowing the cultural sensitivities around the conversation and making sure that all the team were across all of the different topics that would go with that.
Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming when you say not moderating, they were taken off everything to do with the Voice referendum, or just taken out of all? Yeah, we'll take moderation out all moderation for NITV for that period. Yeah. Was the decision around that because everything was going to be infected by the Voice? Absolutely. I mean, even the other guys might chime in on this as well, but some posts that we were closed off, comments were closed off to stop the influx that was coming in. So then those people who wanted to comment on that would then spill into something else, completely unrelated. With SBS themselves, we manage multiple channels. So there's SBS News, SBS Australia, SBS On Demand, SBS Insight. And comments were coming that would have been directed at NITV were coming into those channels and getting quite nasty there as well. Okay, and then you also are at you're looking after the Australian Democracy Museum. So for those of you who are not Australian, that is a government organisation, it's a government-funded museum. What was it like there? Was there a different approach? Well, the different approach was the main content that they were putting out was about the democratic process itself. So it wasn't necessarily, okay, this event's just happened or this politician's just said this. It was specifically about, well, what are referendums and why is that different to a plebiscite, for instance? What is the question that the referendum's asking and what would be the impacts of that on the Constitution? So it was very much focused particularly on the democratic process. But again, comments spilled into that were not related to the democratic process, but purely people's beliefs or opinions on what should be happening with it. Okay, fantastic. Catherine, you were talking when we were in preparation, you were talking about the fact that at the ABC you employed some chats for the moderators as a way of helping to support them. Could you just talk a little bit about how that operated and the decision behind opening up those chats? Because I know from experience that that's not a normal thing that you do with the moderators.
Yeah, we just made sure there was a, I think we had some wellbeing sessions beforehand, which I think is maybe where the idea came from to start with, where the team said they'd really like to be feeling connected on the day. So we had, as well as like the kind of, more professional sort of chat going on, they also had a more sort of casual one where they could connect with colleagues and just have this space to support each other, I guess. And they have since told me they found that just a really great thing for them on the day. They were sharing things as simple as, here's the lunch I'm eating today, and my snacks I've got with me while I'm moderating today. The music they were listening to, they were sharing a playlist with like First Nations artists that they were listening to that day too in that chat. So yeah, they found that really useful.
That's fantastic. And that is kind of a different approach. So it sounds like you kind of all of you have did quite a bit of prep leading up. It sounds, Dave, like The Guardian has been prepping for this for years, in terms of what's going on. Would you say that this approach that you took was different to the general moderation approach that you would take for other contentious or sensitive topics, or is this a sort of approach that you would have used for those anyway?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So I think I mentioned in our preparation sort of chat for this that we took the same approach. So when I talked to our moderators about it, we took the same approach that we've pretty much had to the voice throughout, and all Indigenous issues, is that we have pre-moderated comments on all voice-related articles. And so we have the option on site to have set pre-moderation, tell commenters that comments on this piece are pre-moderated. And so because they'd already been doing that for a year, it wasn't a huge change in approach. And I guess it was interesting talking to the mods that, they said that, yes, while it did ramp up and like dial up to 11 with, just random people, flying in on a, just flooding in on those issues, there was also, it looked like, it's pretty standard with what they had, that all the conversations voice related had already been hashed out over the last 10-12 months, and so there was nothing new necessarily coming into the comments unexpected, so they were pretty well prepared for that. There was just a lot more volume of not just comments but stories. Like our coverage, our publishing level volume was up significantly in the lead up, as it got closer, kept going up, and so that just as well brought about more comments. But I think otherwise, like that is different to what we did with other contentious issues. Like it was just pre-moderation, and we also chose which stories. It wasn't every voice story would have comments open with pre-moderation. It was choosing which ones they were going to get beneficial engagement out of.
Okay, so the decision was made about, is this just going to get a lot of hate, or is this going to actually, create real discussion in the commentary?
Yeah, not necessarily is it going to get a lot of hate, because everything will, but more, can the moderated and directed comments and engagement elevate be beneficial to the overall conversation. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And Catherine, how was it different at the ABC? Because you're the national broadcaster, so you're covering all sorts of different issues all around the country. How was your approach to moderation for The Voice different from any other sort of big contentious event that the ABC has covered?
Yeah, probably the amount of planning around staffing, responses, wellbeing, like I mentioned. And yeah, with the cues that I mentioned, the moderation cues that we used as well, we set up a specific racism cue for this too on our moderation platform. So previously we had a cue that just brought in a combination of all sorts of problematic comments, but like the dedicated cue, it helped with moderator preparedness. They knew what they were going to be in for if they looked at that cue. And it also met Indigenous staff or just moderators who needed a break knew they could avoid that cue. So it was a really great strategy, I think, in preparing for that. And that's a lot of those changes have been lasting. Like we're still using that cue. We still do wellbeing check-ins now for other things following on for that because it works so well. Switching more comments off.
Yeah. So you also said when we were talking that one of the things that you did with your team was to give them a lot more agency, thinking about Dave talking about the comments that were switched on and off, a lot more agency over the ability to switch off comments when things were getting a little bit hairy. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that came about?
Yeah, just really wanting to encourage them to be intentional about what posts were open for comment, that it could be a productive conversation and a safe place for the audience to be, or any talent featured in that story the post is linking to as well. We were really conscious of that. So yeah, just making them feel empowered was really important, to switch off comments and to be able to manage their workload too.
Yeah. And of course, that agency element is also a really, really big part of well-being, feeling that you have control over what's going on in your workplace when it comes to issues like this as well.
100%.
Yeah. Dan, how was it different to the usual things that you moderate?
Yeah, there was a lot more care, as you say, to moderator wellbeing. So everyone had access to counselling sessions if they wanted them. We did have a lot more hours on, but with the size of our team, we can switch people out if someone says they need a break. My team's empowered to step away from the keyboard if they ever need to. So it was very much and again, same as Catherine was saying with the racism inbox, we've got a dedicated NITV inbox and high risk kind of posts inbox. So it was easy enough for people to go, okay, well, I need a break from staring at all of that negativity. I want to go and moderate something on SBS On Demand, for instance, which gives them a bit lighter subject matter. So.
Yeah, and I can see Vanessa's has already preempted something that I was going to ask. She does this. We have the same brain sometimes, Vanessa Pagan and I. And the question that I have for all of you is because we're talking about like shutting down comments, and I know that news organizations and particularly the ABC and SBS get a lot of kickback when they start shutting down stories for comments, or even when they moderate people's commentary. Can you talk a little bit about what was going on in that space and how that was part of the whole ecology of this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can start that one. We're happy to have healthy debate. That's never a problem, and SBS doesn't want to be censoring anybody. It's definitely open for discussion, but when that discussion starts becoming a pile-on and vitriolic, it's just not adding anything to that conversation. As Dave said, it's not elevating it. So we want to be able to have that conversation and allow people to have their opinion without it being full of misinformation or full of hate speech, or and especially in the light of the Dylan Voller decision, which some of the audience may know about. Defamation law is really strict in Australia, and when you've got say, posts on Professor Marsha Langton or Noel Pearson or Briggs, the Australian musician, there's a lot of those sorts of people where comments get thrown about in the threads, which may not have the best interests.
So just sort of making sure but did the organisation come under a lot of criticism around this at the time?
It does all the time. I mean, we've just had Eurovision most recently, and there were times that we've had to close down comments on Eurovision posts, and exactly the same thing. What about my free speech?
Yeah. So it's a sort of a normal thing. Catherine, how did the ABC cope with that?
Yeah, like that was definitely a big point of discussion for us. For the team, it was really hard sort of walking that line, deciding when to switch off comments, wanting to allow productive conversation, but not wanting comments to, and they were building up very quickly as well, I will say. So it was very, easy for them to quickly get out of hand. But yeah, not wanting comments to be harmful for audience members when they got like that. So just trying to, make sure they were still keeping it a safe place and that they were, not overwhelmed with all the comments they were dealing with, because it was incredible how fast they would build up on a post. Yeah,
I think this also leads me into sort of another thinking about how fast they were moving up, and that sort of how dare you moderate me thing, because we know that is also often a part of the dis and misinformation highway as well. And this was a referendum that saw an enormous amount of very harmful disinformation and misinformation floating around. So I'm really interested to know how it was at each of your organisations, and maybe starting with you, Catherine, and then Dave and Dan. How did you deal with that mis and disinformation? Were you seeing more of it than you usually do? What was it looking like?
Yeah, we definitely were. There was, how it would appear often people were copy pasting the same comment across multiple posts. It kind of didn't matter what the post topic was, to be honest. It was, like we talked about, was spilling over onto all sorts of posts. So that was probably the main place we would see that misinformation. And having the session, I mentioned ahead of the referendum coverage, with the team leading that coverage, was really helpful, where we could ask questions and really get to understand things. The ABC also had a referendum hub set up for us that they kept updated with the latest information and advice, like common threads of misinformation that were out there. So that was really helpful for moderators in working out what the situation was, I guess.
And did you, Dave, did you see more disinformation coming across? What was the approach there? How did that work?
Yeah, so our moderators pretty much said a similar thing, with everything was sort of like dialed up to 11 on the voice. And yeah, you would have some of the big name people like Marsha Langton, things like that, where there's a story about her, and then what appeared to be coordinated responses to flooding in and trying to discredit what they've said or the individual and things like that. So having to combat that, and also they found that there were a lot of people who would come in and sort of mentioned this before, parrot talking points that had been aired by conservative politicians or conservative media, and then the moderators would see that repeated almost verbatim in the types of comments that were coming through over and over again. Like they were getting, picking that up outside and trying to spread it so it almost becomes the, say it enough and people think that's the truth. So they had to combat that kind of thing as well, and keep an eye out for changes, I guess, in people's approaches, attempting to get around that sort of get around the mods understanding what is and isn't what's the word, behavior that's attempting to I guess manipulate what's going on.
Yeah. And were there any attempts, this is for both you and Catherine, Dave, were there any attempts to sort of correct any of this or misinformation as you saw it coming up?
For us, less so. I mean, we did in our coverage, so we would often have some fact checks or the 8 biggest untruths about the voice that are spreading around. But we wouldn't do it in the comments themselves. So I suppose, like I already said, it helped that we would have pre-moderation on voice-related stuff anyway. So there was ability to just not allow that to get seen, but the mods still had to deal with, the huge amount of it that they were having to see and reject before it appeared. So we didn't necessarily need to do something beforehand. Although I did mention that there was, when we do have pre-moderation on a piece, the comments will start it with a pinned comment post that says community moderation team. This piece will have pre-moderated comments, just so people coming in know immediately. And they found that could often just put people off from the outset, because they know that, if their stuff is not above board, then it's not going to make it through anyway.
So there's no point at that.
Yeah.
Catherine, how did the ABC cope with, obviously you moderated it out, but like, were there any approaches sort of around that sort of corrective behavior?
Yeah, so we had prepared responses ahead of time for comments we expected, questions we were expecting. And when we noticed people starting to share common threads of misinformation, we had some responses prepared for that. Also, we'd share links to articles, relevant articles, or lines from those articles, and go here to read more. But also feeding back what we were seeing in editorial meetings was really useful as well, that we could say, the audience are really confused about this particular thing. There's a lot of misinformation spreading about this. Could we do an article explaining it? So that was, and then we could go back and share that. So that was really good as well.
Okay, that's fantastic. And Dan, what about you? What was the approach?
Yeah, I mean, we were feeding everything back to editorial as well, within SBS as default process, but there was no commentary countering the misinformation, so to speak. There's a lot that I would have liked to have counter, but the approach at the time was to go with the volume, and the volume of comments. There was just too many to reply to and have that moderation time. So there was a lot that we would have learned from that, and probably will approach future events differently, and maybe counter some of that misinformation where we can. I know there's been some great examples in Australia over the past 10 years of people doing that and having success in turning those conversations. So I think there's opportunity there. But again, same as what Dave said, there was a lot of conservative media talking points. There was a lot of, I'm terminally online myself, so I'd see a lot of things go from Twitter straight into the comment threads on Facebook. And it's just the volume of it was really a big thing that went against the idea of replying to some of them.
So would you say that sort of that volume was the biggest difficulty that you were all...
Yeah. I mean, we had posts where you might get an average of 100 to 200 comments per post on a particular channel for, if the post's been up a week, they'd be getting 3,000 or 4,000 overnight. So it was such a rise in commentary, and obviously such a polarizing topic. So
yeah. And I guess also then, you were talking then about like seeing stuff coming in from Twitter and other organizations. And I sort of have a question, and I know I asked it previously, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about, which is Did you see a lot of sort of borrowed talking points or commenters coming in from places that were not Australia, who we wouldn't normally see in these discussions?
Absolutely. One example which I was thinking of this morning was a lot of American commenters going, oh, well, if it goes through in Australia, then our Indigenous are going to want the same thing. And so they would go in and have their own, whether it was from Reddit groups or whatever, they would have their sort of bullet points of reasons why it shouldn't go through, and they would just start flooding the comments as well. So there was a lot of inauthentic behavior, and it's all moderators know. Sometimes you can see a flood of comments that are very, very similar in wording, and it's hard to know whether it's inauthentic to the point of being a bot farm or whether it's bandwagoning from some group somewhere else. Maybe 4chan has put up something about it and put a link to that article, and then all of these 4chan users come flooding into the comments. So it's one of those things we are looking more into as to how to report on those things and manage those things. But at the moment, the turning off the comments is probably the safest way to do that if it starts happening.
So is that sort of something that you all saw as well, Catherine and Dave?
Yeah, I think
coming from outside.
Yeah, I don't know about so much outside, but just sort of similar to what I already said about. I don't think our stuff didn't get so much read in the US and UK, but yeah, there's just that, as one of our mods called them, anti-woke flying monkeys, just coming in and trying to jump on whatever the story of the day is and bang on about whatever they were trying to say about the voice that day. Yeah,
we did as well. Yeah, I mean, on any day we often get people confusing us with ABC in America, so it's not super uncommon for us, but we definitely had some American voices in our comments, I would say, in particular. And yeah, like Dan was saying, a lot of the time that was the copy paste comments we were seeing that seemed really, coordinated, perhaps.
Well, this sort of coordinated response in the copy paste leads me to ask a question from our chat, which is what sorts of tools were you using in automating and streamlining some of these processes, and perhaps was that helpful in being able to shut down some of that bot commentary or sort of get it out of the feed faster?
We moved probably 2 months prior to the voice referendum. We moved onto Sprout Social, which gives you a lot more control in your moderating. So it was easier to filter keywords, to set up particular inboxes, as I said, an inbox specifically for NITV. Be able to tag certain posts as high risk or certain posts as road to referendum and have those go into a specific inbox so that they could be addressed separately to the rest of it. Yeah, that was probably our biggest tool at the time. Prior to that, we were using Business Suite, which was not the easiest one for anyone who's got experience moderating on that.
Was that decision made to move to Sprout Social because you knew the referendum was coming up, or was it just something the organisation was thinking?
I think it was brought forward because of that. So it was something that had been in the works and had been in discussion within the team as would like to move to a platform that gives better reporting and better access for moderators. And then with Road to Referendum coming, we knew there would be a huge influx of negativity. So it was a much easier platform to use than Business Suite, and also gives you that visibility of what's actually been read and marked as resolved.
Yeah, Catherine?
Yeah, we like I mentioned, we in our moderation platform, we filtered any racist words into a queue, so you could go there and find a lot of them there. We also set up a spam queue with to catch all the bots and sort of go through there and ban a lot of those, and that's in addition to the auto hidden words caught by the filters. So yeah, that caught a lot of them, I would say.
Were you using native filters or were you using other?
No, No,
the
in
software?
chorus. We use chorus, yeah.
Okay. So it is
And native to hide, yeah.
and native to hide. So there's another question here then I guess that it also sort of feeds into this, and that is around like, how do we lobby some of these platforms to perhaps also to give us better, I guess, better tools, and also lobby them around things like hate speech and racism to do a better job?
It's a tough discussion because that's been happening for years that I'm aware of, with people lobbying Meta, for example, and trying to get better moderation tools or a better platform to moderate within Meta, better filters on hate speech, that kind of thing. And it just, they make small changes here and there, but it doesn't seem to be a effective approach at this stage.
I think also they aren't motivated to introduce controls that reduce engagement when comments are a huge part of engagement on the Meta platform, at least on Facebook. And the move to introducing the allowed comment moderation on Facebook posts from the who can comment thing. Everyone, pages and people you mention, and something else, or followers only, or something like that. That only came about because of the Voller decision. Like, there was no option other than hide before that to, or delete or hide comments before that to moderate. And bringing in that option took a while and was, only done under great duress, basically. So, and it's still not ideal. So I can't imagine that they would be interested in doing more beyond that in things that we might like.
I watched a video with a guy called Andrew Bustamante the other day, and he talked about it, and he said the rise in online hate speech is very productive for the platforms, because the polarization of the audience does exactly what Dave said. It brings in eyeballs and keeps those eyeballs on there for a lot longer, which then drives up their advertising, because look how many people we're reaching. So it's the motivation to make a better society for all, or the motivation to make more money. So it's a toss up between the two sometimes, I think.
And it may not be relevant to this conversation, but you can see that with the Facebook became very embarrassed around the 2016 election, just after, when I can't remember who was running it. A particular US journalist was running a top Facebook, posts in the US daily, top 10 posts by engagement, and they were almost always just very right-wing media being the most engaged with link posts across the United States every single day. And it really brought up that issue that, this hate and outrage was really just supercharging engagement for these conservative far-right operators, and some of the pages, very far-right. And that's what led to, rather than Facebook necessarily dealing with it, was choosing to shut down CrowdTangle, because that's what was being used to be able to see what engagement was being achieved in different countries. Yeah.
Catherine, what do you think about this sort of question? Should we, or do we need to lobby these providers more to provide better moderation tools, but just more in general to do more about this?
I think the ability to switch off comments that was mentioned, it's like that was enormously helpful once we finally got that. I think it's not perfect yet, though. It could definitely be improved. Like having the ability to switch off comments when you're scheduling something more easily. There's we were talking about it the other day, there's a way, but it's, it's not very simple. And yeah, like that sort of thing would have been really helpful with posts on this, on the voice referendum, because we were finding if something went up that we did want to have comments off on, but they were left on for a really small amount of time, that could be enough for it to just become unmanageable. And yeah, how fast comments could build up on those posts was incredible.
Yeah, I think that's always the problem, isn't it? Once it starts, it gives everyone permission to keep the hate going. And I guess that is one of the core jobs of a moderator, is to really set the culture and the tone of those comment sections in the institutions overall, but then on each post as well, because you've got to keep monitoring that. So that's a really tough job, which kind of leads me to sort of thinking about, with all of this around things like moderator self-care and all of those things, as we go into what is going to be an incredibly contentious US election. And I know that in the US, they've been incredibly worried post the referendum here, because of what they saw with the mis and disinformation and the hate speech and the volume of commentary going on here. They're incredibly concerned that that is going to be repeated during those elections. And of course, we're not just going into US elections. This is going to be a super election year with many countries going into their elections. What kind of lessons do you think you have as people who sort of looked at these moderation processes and ran these moderation processes for The Voice, for people coming into these scenarios in the future?
I'll jump in first, just like I think it's easiest for me to answer because, and I haven't mentioned on this session yet, but we don't have comments open on Facebook for Guardian Australia specifically. So it's easier for us, I guess, because we know that outrage and flood of misinformation will be there, but we don't have to moderate it on the Guardian Australia Facebook page. Part of the reason for that is our moderators are strictly on site only because of the volume of comments that we have here, and it's always been that we don't have scope for them to go on social as well. And so in that respect, I think, yeah, I can just say with all of that coming up, it's slightly less of an issue for us than others who have to deal with the social media onslaught.
But you also say, because you've only got 2 moderators in Australia, is that right? But everyone moderates as a global team. And
Yep.
I think one of the things I find interesting is that Australia did come up with that sort of global playbook for how to moderate First Nations content overseas. Do you think that things like that within organisations that operate in multiple jurisdictions, having those different playbooks that are shared globally, do you think that that's part of the kind of good planning that we should be thinking about as moderators going forward?
Yeah, I think so. Like, it's particularly for us because, the Guardian is much bigger outside of Australia, obviously, than it is inside of Australia, but we still, one of the bigger publishers here, that there's much more volume internationally, and I think it will always help for moderators anywhere to have guidance and guidelines of what is sensitive and appropriate for different regions, and peculiarities of language that would not be understood in other places or not be seen immediately to be offensive or a racist trope, and things like that. And I think that's the particular value of our Australian team putting together that document for Australian Indigenous stuff, and it's 3 pages of stuff, including terms that people outside Australia would not even know what it meant, but that it's a racist or offensive trope that needs to be looked out for. And so, yeah, it would always be beneficial to be prepared in other regions as well.
And so that playbook, just to be clear, that was generated in consultation with your First Nations editor?
Yeah, our Indigenous Affairs editor.
Yeah.
So perhaps not the entire thing in consultation, but yeah, definitely parts of it that were, there's stuff that they just know is, specific to Australia and Indigenous Australians. And then, yeah, I think we've shared it with the Indigenous Affairs editor to, have input on it. Yeah.
And I know that that was the case also at the ABC and also then at SBS around this as well, was bringing in those First Nations people to sort of speak to how they would like to be involved in moderation or not, and their responses and things. So that was folded into the moderation practice. Catherine, what would you say are the big lessons from the ABC over this that it would be good to know going into the future?
Yeah, I would say, like, I want to agree first that, yeah, having a First Nations-led approach with our moderation on this was really key. And yeah, just consulting with people who had a lived experience. Lessons, I'd say probably less posts open for comment in the lead up to the referendum, because we found comments just built up really quickly, like I mentioned, and just swiftly became problematic when they were open. And it just made it really hard for the team to keep on top of them. More planning around moderation considerations for after the referendum too. We hadn't perhaps realised just how much racism we were going to be seeing in the comments in the weeks after, or even continuing on further than that. The team have let me know that they feel like there's just been a quite a significant uptick in racist comments ever since. Prioritizing moderator wellbeing was a really big lesson. That was something that we built into the planning of this, and that has continued. Having a clear plan with the prepared responses and upward referral and that sort of thing beforehand, before we post anything, having answers to questions we were expecting. Just being more intentional as well about which conversations we were having with the audience, which posts were open for comment, and that when a post was open for comment, we were having a really good quality, active, focused moderation there. So you're really putting the effort, I guess, into maybe fewer posts open for comment, but there were really good quality conversations hopefully happening there.
Okay, great. And Dan?
I think the big takeaway for me is the proliferation of misinformation and being able to counter that. And I think part of that is, again, feeding it back to the editorial team and saying, look, we are seeing an influx of whether it's copy-paste comments or just similarly worded comments that are all focused on this one topic or one bullet point. And then having the editorial team be able to counter that, whether that's in the comments or whether that's with a post. But then you also have to look at human behavior. You can't just tell someone they're wrong and they immediately go, oh, hang on, maybe I'm wrong. You've got to be able to cross to their side and then bring them back, and I think that's something that a lot of teams can probably do better. Because some of the misinformation is so blatantly misinformed that it should be easily counterable, but the tendency has been to shy away from that. So I think that the biggest lesson for me would be getting on the front foot of that rather than just shipping away from it.
Do you think that would be a case of also with moderation teams training them in how to have those conversations, how to do that that stepping across when they're seeing mis and disinformation, if they're going to be correcting comments in?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely training people and empowering them to feel okay in replying. You don't need to reply to every single comment, but sometimes, as an example, there was a COVID discussion happening recently, and someone commented it was about a patient who had had a heart attack or heart arrest in 2009, and of course the comments got flooded. Oh, well, this is due to vaccines, and there was enough people pushing back on that, going, "Hang on, it happened in 2009. How is that possible to be related to vaccines?" That it was fine to leave that up because that's showing the community sort of correcting the course itself. So it's helping facilitate those discussions as well.
So do you think then in that facilitation, and this is a question for everyone, one, there's some moderator training that needs to happen around mis and disinformation, around how to handle it, how to recognize it, and what to do when it starts coming through. And I'm sure that you're all aware that Australian Community Managers actually makes and does that training for people if they want to do it. But I think the other end of it is, how do you empower then audiences to actually operate as bystanders in those environments and go in and feel comfortable enough to correct that information as well?
Yeah, that's a good question, because with the volume of negativity, sometimes the audience doesn't want to engage. They think there's no point in me commenting back to this person. I'm not going to change their mind. But then the COVID example is a perfect one where the audience does feel empowered to jump in and say, hang on, that's completely wrong.
It's the best thing when the audience self-moderates. That's always great to see. We love it. And I think how we try and encourage that is by being there in the comments ourselves really actively and making sure that audience members can see that and they know that they're trying to keep it a safe place for them, that they feel then comfortable interacting, that we'll be there watching.
Yeah, so it's about, again, creating those expectations in the commentary, which is a moderation approach, but of course it's also a community manager approach as well. So I think that's also maybe sort of lessons that you could learn that has been learned from the sort of more community management approach. Dan, when we were talking, and you and Catherine were talking, it's maybe not so much for Dave, but actually maybe Dave as well, because you do have those commentaries. You were talking about the sorts of lists that organisations hold of the known troublemakers. Can you talk to me a little bit about what the approach was around those people coming into something like The Voice, and like how thinking about how we use those lists and what we do with those lists might be something that's very, very useful whenever there's a contentious issue coming up or moderating in these types of environments?
Yeah, well, just for myself, because I was across multiple channels, there were people you recognise on each channel. And there's a list of names that we recognised on that weren't related to NITV, but were definitely very active pretty much nightly on other channels. And then when the Voice to Referendum or Road to Referendum started, they would come over and start commenting on NITV. And I'm going, well, I know that name, but I know that that's not a channel they're usually active on. And the comments that they would leave on the other channel were never the type of comments that were going to contribute to this discussion in a healthy or positive way. So it's just easier to go, okay, well, the minute they cross that line, block them from that page. Like there's not one ever comment that they've posted that would indicate to me that they're going to be a healthy community member. And as I said, it comes down to, we're not community builders, we're community facilitators. We're trying to facilitate a healthy discussion. We're all for healthy debate, but not if it's someone who's just going to derail those conversations every time.
Yeah. Catherine?
Yeah, we found it really useful looking back at a user's comment history. So there were a lot you could look at, and they were just copy pasting again across multiple ABC accounts. So maybe that's what they were doing initially, just going across them all. Some of them would get banned from one and just go to another and start posting there instead. So yeah, it was great to have that context to know there's a pattern of behavior here. There's, they're just spamming the comments. But yeah, as soon as they left a racist comment, like there were no chances or anything, we would ban them for doing that. So yeah.
Yeah, and how were you able to see were you using natives, or was this something that you were able to see?
In Chorus, we can click on a user and see it's set up so that we can see their history and what they've been commenting. So it's very useful, in understanding.
Dave?
Yeah, so our internal system, even if someone's been banned, which doesn't happen a lot, but even if their stuff's not visible on site, we've still got that full history in our comments tool. And so I was asking our mods about this, and yeah, if someone's coming back again and again and trying to start new accounts and commenting, they can sometimes recognize that and go back and say, I think this is so and so, who we all know because we've had a problem for years with them, and can go back into their comment history of that user and see, okay, they're using the same stuff, that we know that they're that returned banned user, and we can do something with that. And back on the reader community self-moderation, our comments also have a report function in our internal tool on site comments. And so, yeah, a lot of times readers who are regulars and see, stuff that's not great that we might have missed or things like that, they will self-report it as well and can add notes to their report and that'll kick it to the top of the queue for our moderators, that readers, our regulars, will help out in the process as well.
Yeah. I know though that we get those users who are constantly coming in and just skirting the line, but they're bad actors, but they're just skirting the line. They never really cross it, so you can't really ban them. How did you sort of manage that? Did you sort of take an approach where is a learning to potentially go, that they're coming in, they're constantly just sitting on that line, and that itself is a malicious sort of act. It's in there to stir up the trouble. Did you make decisions to get rid of any of those people?
Absolutely. Yeah, there were instances, especially leading into the voice, where we had people who in the past, it might have been, well, until they cross that line, we don't touch it. We'll put them on a watch list. We know who they are. But, until there's enough examples to back up why we would ban them. But with something as sensitive as the voice, there was just no leeway on that. It was the minute they made a racist comment, or we could see that they weren't doing anything in the interests of the discussion, then it's just get rid of it.
Catherine, was that similar at the ABC?
Yeah, as soon as their intentions were clear, we were banning. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that's a learning then, isn't it? Is to sort of not wait for them to say the thing that that they're hinting at, but instead to go, this is what you're hinting at, and we're not even going to allow that around these really sensitive things. So I'm looking at the time, and I want to say thank you very much for being with us, but it is the end of the yoga class. Is there anything that you'd like to add to these discussions and this panel, that a question I haven't asked you, something that's suddenly hit your mind, like, oh my gosh, no, you have to do this when you're doing things in the future?
Yeah, I feel awkward using myself as an example, but the lessons from when I worked at Optus, and a lot of you know the history of that, was countering that misinformation in the comments in a friendly way was really effective. The one that jumps out is there was a whole discussion around, there's Muslim children that left a school assembly because they hate our national anthem. And I went, well, hang on, there was an article in The Guardian about that maybe a year and a half ago. And so I quickly Googled, and there's the article, and actually explained that they were from a particular sect of Islam and they're not allowed to celebrate any music that month because it was a music of joy. So it didn't matter if it was the anthem or if it was David Bowie or if it was, something else. they were not allowed to listen to music during that month. So it had nothing to do with the anthem, but the misinformation had spread that so many people were commenting that as if it was fact. Being able to point them to that article and saying, well, actually, did you know this is why? Suddenly that dropped. So it was an example, I think, of being able to counter that misinformation in a good way and then change the narrative.
So that sort of ability to sort of turn people around.
Yeah. Well, just as you said, pointing them to the facts. Quite often, a lot of them haven't read the article, they've read a title, or they've heard from someone at the pub or someone on Facebook or whatever, and they just feel, well, that's what happened. And if it isn't what happened, then being able to counter that and say, well, here's the actual reasoning behind it, is quite often more effective than just ignoring it.
Amazing. Catherine, did you have anything that you wanted to add or expand on?
Yeah, no, I'd say probably one of the big things to be on the lookout for was we found the audience were just every day finding new, what they thought were sneaky ways to be racist in the comments and trying to bypass our filters and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's really something to be watching out for, and to be constantly updating filters too was really important.
Yeah. Dave?
It might have already been covered before, but yeah, I think just how much work was put into pre-moderating our discussions from our mods was, it was a really intense period, and they did it amazingly well in pre-moderating, and then ultimately getting rid of some users as necessary, and refining how those stories go and how the discussions below the line go. And so while there was some fatigue in that final week, they'd also streamlined it, so it was much easier, and they were already putting people off who were, I guess, casually disruptive. The most disruptive are hard to put off, but the casually disruptive ones give up a little more easily, and are put off by pre-moderation and how you manage those discussions and direct them. So yeah, I think that was really important for our mods here, and that really helped.